We are contemporary people, but we're rooted to our past and present and future. We got to still remember where we came from, what our ancestors sacrificed for us to be here where we're at today, and then be thankful for that, but then also look forward that we're providing for the future generations.
This is Hourglass, the podcast for United Way of King County in Seattle. Coming up, we'll chat with Scott Pinkham of United Indians of All Tribes Foundation, a Seattle-based cultural center and social service provider for Indigenous people in our area. We'll also discuss United Way's Our Neighbor Fund and an upcoming volunteer opportunity. I'm your host, Joe Burris. Thanks for tuning in. To know the history of modern-day Seattle is to know the story of Bernie Whitebear, an Indigenous activist and visionary who spent much of his life fighting for the Seattle area's Indigenous population and helping Indigenous communities preserve and celebrate their culture and heritage. Whitebear was born on the Colville Reservation in 1937. He moved to Tacoma in 1956, the same year the United States government's Indian Relocation Act lured Indigenous people from their reservations to urban areas by promising vocational training, jobs with medical insurance, and resources for housing. For the nearly 200,000 Indigenous people who left reservations for the big cities, the lure was powerful. It meant leaving rural areas where opportunities were scarce for the promise of a better life and a chance to assimilate into mainstream society with help from the Fed. Whitebear in 1960 volunteered at an Indigenous center in downtown Seattle that served as a first stop for Indigenous people arriving to the big city. But a better life for Indigenous people wasn't the federal government's true intention. Instead, it sought to remove the people from reservations so that the land could be sold for residential and commercial development. And once Indigenous people were removed from their reservations and scattered throughout American cities, their tribal government, their culture, their traditions, and ultimately the tribes themselves would be eliminated too. Of course, that never happened. But what did occur was that many who left their reservations for big cities like Seattle weren't given the jobs, housing, training, or assimilation support that they were promised. Instead, the Indian Relocation Act sowed the seeds of urban Indigenous poverty, leaving people cut off from their homelands and depriving them of the means to develop their own vibrant, self-sustaining communities in the big city. That's where people like Bernie Whitebear stepped in. He ultimately became an activist who sought to help Indigenous people to reconnect to their heritage and strengthen their bonds as a community. He founded the United Indian Peoples Council in 1970 and sought to establish a gathering place for Indigenous people at the recently closed Fort Lawton Army Base in Magnolia. The government originally intended for the closed facility to be used as an anti-ballistic missile base before local residents convinced the Fed to allow a portion to be used as a park. But in March of 1970, Whitebear and the United Indian Peoples Council descended on the former Fort Lawton and laid claim to it, citing an 1865 treaty between Indigenous people and the U.S. government that granted surplus military lands to the original owners. Whitebear and the council said the land would thereby be reclaimed in the name of all Indigenous people to pursue their ways of life. According to published reports, Whitebear and the others came with cooking utensils, food, and sleeping bags, but they were met by military police dressed in riot gear. The Indigenous people were arrested, but they returned and their protests grew. News of their protests spread nationwide, and with the summer of 1971 came a breaking point. Negotiations started between the Indigenous people, the city of Seattle, and U.S. congressional representatives. Bernie Whitebear and the other activists formed United Indians of All Tribes Foundation to represent Indigenous interests in the negotiations over the future of Fort Lawton. In November of 1971, an agreement was reached with the United Indians of All Tribes for a 99-year lease to build an Indigenous cultural center in the park. The groundbreaking ceremony took place in September of 1975, and the Daybreak Star Cultural Center was opened in May of 1977. The founders of United Indians then began the process of building up the organization into a social service provider, education center, and cultural center. Daybreak Star's permanent art collection includes Blue Jay, a 30-foot wide, 12-foot high sculpture created by Bernie Whitebear's brother, Lonnie Reyes. The 20-parcel acre of land that members of United Indians of all tribes were once arrested for occupying is now open to the public. It is a testament to an organized group of relocated Indigenous people who, armed with the determination not to be moved again, held their ground on Indigenous land, took on the U.S. government, and won. Whitebear also founded the Seattle Indian Health Board and was a member of the Gang of Four with Larry Gossett, Bob Santos, and Roberto Maestas, who together challenged Seattle's status quo from the 1960s to 1980s, demanding equity and social justice for minorities and women. And according to published reports, Whitebear was also involved in the planning of the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. Whitebear died in 2000, but today his vision for a place where Indigenous people can thrive in their own heritage and culture still lives. Last year, United Indians of all tribes received a $2 million grant from the U.S. Department of Labor as part of the Biden administration's efforts to provide worker-centered sector strategy training programs in 25 states and the District of Columbia. United Indians of all tribes was one of only 34 organizations to receive the grant. United Way of King County proudly supports United Indians of All Tribes Foundation and its efforts to provide an array of culturally responsive services and programming to King County's urban Native community. United Indians is a member of the Indigenous Communities Fund, a resource that United Way launched in 2020 in response to COVID-19's impact on Indigenous communities. Earlier this year, we sat down with United Indians of All Tribes Equity Program Manager Scott Pinkham about the organization's impact and its founder, Whitebear. Here's what Pinkham had to say.
Bernie Whitebear, when he came here to this area, when he noticed, there was a lack for the Indigenous people here, many of whom were relocated off their reservations. They didn't have a place really to be Indigenous, to be American Indian, to be Native, whatever nation they came from. So he saw that need. We need to have a place that, in a sense, we can call our own, where we can go and be ourselves, be our traditional, as much as we can, cultural selves. In the big urban settings for our Indigenous population, we have to balance that, living between two worlds. How do we hold on to our culture and traditions, yet still be in this modern world that we're contemporary people? So that's what kind of Bernie's Whitebear. Let me find this place for us that we can build a spot where our urban people, who are going to be very diverse in this area, they're not all just Coast Salish peoples, but people from across this Turtle Island to come and have a place we can call our own. Because you saw other communities would have, like the International District, where they can go and, hey, yes, this is our culture. And to see that lack when we're on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people, that there wasn't a place for them to be themselves. So again, I just provided them a resource, a place where they can go for some guidance, some assistance, some reassurance that who they are is okay to be in this, in a sense, contemporary times.
What are some of the areas and some of the things that United Indians has done to make that reality?
Yeah, well, some of the founding things that they wanted to make sure that they had, some cultural activities and venues for them to come and practice those, having the social services that they may need in these urban areas. And education was another key thing that, Bernie wanted to make sure that was provided at the site. So, cultural, social, educational types of support services. So right now we can look at United Indians, and we have Daybreak Star preschool. So allows for our people that are interested to come there. It's not just entirely for Indigenous people, but for those that want, hey, here's where I want to go and help my youngster get ready for school. And it does have that Native focus on it, but it's not just for Indigenous populations. And so that kind of addresses some of the educational things that we're looking at. Then we have the family services there and community services. I myself am with the family services, where I am the equity program manager. So we can make sure that our Indigenous community feel like they're having a voice, that their voice is being heard, that any services will be aware of their needs, not just to have equal access, but equitable access to services. Also under our family services is the Ina Macaw program, which is for urban natives that have fairly recently new children, so in-home services. Let's go and help them with raising their new child. And then we also have a foster care system program where people can get licensed to be foster care parents, which is a need when you look at such things as the Indian Child Welfare Act. We need to be able to place our Indigenous youth with Indigenous families as much as we can. So encourage our Indigenous families out there to become, licensed, so they can take on a child that may need the care. We also have traditional medicine that we're going to kind of revive. It kind of went dormant. We're looking at reviving it to bring it back. And what I like about what we're approaching with this traditional medicine, it's holistic. We want to take a holistic view that it isn't just the drugs or treatments that you can go through for being healthy, physical health. We're also looking at mental health, cultural health. The overall wellness is what contributes to someone being healthy. That we look at it as the life ways. When you're sick, it's going to be your part of being unbalanced. Maybe you're not having that spiritual connection that you need to be healthy. Maybe it's the physical connection or the emotional connection. So we're trying to see how we can bring that traditional ways of life to this traditional medicine ideas. We actually just had a meeting today talking about it, the need for us to be able to have access to maybe traditional plants, reviving our language, just being able to have that pride in that we are Indigenous people, again, from different countries and nations. I talked with them about, yes, you just look at the pride that happened for the Macaw people when they started whaling again, just to be able to, hey, we got back to some of our traditions and just having that mental, yes, I am significant. I am someone, because mental draining on cultures when they were told, the way you live is bad, when we're being colonized by the government. So we're looking at this now as what they call in health survivance. What have we done to still hold on to those traditions that might have went dormant for a while, but we still held on to them, and let's now get them revived. So we're survivors who are resilient, and that's kind of where you get that term survivance. We also have a Labatea Youth Home, which is for homeless youth, looking at 19 to 24 years of age that may need some temporary shelter, to give them a place there they can, teach them the skills to be, survive on their own and get them out there. We have an elders program to help with their elders with their needs that they may have out there, but also to use them as a valuable resource for knowledge. We have a veterans program for our many Indigenous veterans out there that, served the country, not only, for their own nation, but for the United States, that they are protecting their homeland. We have Daybreak Star Cultural Center out at Discovery Park, kind of the Fort Lawn we're talking about the takeover. That's where we're housed at. But there we have rental facilities. We have a sacred art museum. Rotating artists can come in and display their artwork. People come in and view the site. Facilities that people can rent. That's actually where me and my wife got married. So it's a beautiful place, and hopefully host many other events there. We have our annual Seafair Days powwow. It's usually like the third weekend of July or so. This coming year will be July 19th through the 21st. And again, a time for people to come together, our Indigenous people, and celebrate, sing and dance, a gathering, that we are still here. There's also fairly recent, but it may be a few years old, our Daybreak Star Radio. It's an internet-based radio, and their kind of motto is indigenize the airwaves. So it allows for people to come in and share their music, podcasts such as we're doing here, stories that are happening for Indigenous community around this country, around this globe, and that we have a place where, again, hey, I want to see what's happening in Indian country and Indigenous nations. Daybreak Star Radio Network can help fill those needs. But we're always looking for other ways to advance to support our Indigenous community.
According to Statista, Greater Seattle ranks 17th among the nation's metropolitan areas with the highest percentages of Indigenous people. That makes our area rich with Indigenous diversity and culture. But as Indigenous people here straddle between their own heritage and contemporary society, Pinkham said they also battle mainstream stereotypes of being regarded as one homogeneous group.
Powwow is sometimes viewed as more pan-Indian identity, but people don't realize that there's many different tribal nations represented, which you can go see a powwow. The Coast Salish peoples didn't powwow. They'd have different celebrations, often maybe sometimes referred to as a potlatch. But powwow just became a way that when our Indigenous people were forced together by moving from their homelands and reservations, for them to share their traditions and songs and singing and dancing. But then that led to where people thought all Indians are the same. All American Indians wear headdresses, beat on drums, live in teepees, but we are very diverse communities. That's what people know of Indigenous people is often what they see in the media. And so that's where that pan identity comes from, that, oh, yes, I saw a Western, so this is who American Indians are. And they didn't see us as contemporary people. So we kind of had to, fight that. We are contemporary people, but we're rooted to our past and present and future. We got to still remember where we came from, what our ancestors sacrificed for us to be here where we're at today, and then be thankful for that, but then also look forward that we're providing for the future generations. You'll hear the reference to 7 generations, and you'll live for the 7 generations. For the first time that we heard that 7 generations was from once America was expanding and being relocated to the different areas or reservations. We are in that 7th generation now. Okay, we've been 7 generations since someone initially said they'll live for the 7th generation, and we're still here. And I'm proud to say that we are still here, but we're not a pan-Indian identity. We'll maybe rely on that pan-Indian identity for strength, that we can all have these common values, but we want to make sure we're still carrying on the traditions. For me, as I look at powwow, people can say, oh, gee, that's just makes me lead away from my traditions because I'm more seeing that conglomerate of a bunch of Indigenous ways of knowing. But while you're there, you can see someone dancing their traditional dances, see someone singing in their traditional language as well. You may not understand the language they're singing in, but it inspires people to say, oh, if that person learned to sing in their own language, I can go back and learn to sing in my own language. I am myself learning how to, introduce myself in my Indigenous language. I did not learn that growing up. No. So there are, that drawback where bringing attention that people may say, oh, there's no real Indians today, and they'll rely on those stereotypes. But for me, it also then says, hey, we got to make sure that society as a whole is aware that we are not a monolith. We're very diverse communities just here in the city of Seattle. I wouldn't fathom to guess how many different tribal nations we have here in Seattle. My own family, I am Nimipu. My wife's Tlingit, and we have a daughter who's Ojibwe. So we, in a sense, got 3 nations represented within Indigenous nations within my own family. And then if we look at the number of families that are here in Seattle, we got to acknowledge them too.
So how does United Indians of All Tribes Foundation get the word out about your individual work?
Fortunately, as I mentioned, Daybreak Star Radio, internet radio is one way we do it. With outreach that we have with families that already kind of had that connection, talk with them. Myself, being part of the equity programs, you'll probably go to some events out here. You'll see a United Indians of All Tribes table or booth to share information. Working with the local tribes that are in this area. We got the Muckleshoot Nation to the south of us, the Suquamish across the bay, the Snoqualmie, Puyallup, Tulalip tribes, working with them. being aware that those groups are definitely indigenous sovereign nations. And we are a tribal organization. So you're leveraging that network of groups, government nations that can work with other governments, such as the city of Seattle, King County governments. And then we're there also as being, hey, we can help provide services here as well. Because 70% of our indigenous people live in the urban areas and reaching out to them. And that has been something where we're really trying to work with government agencies in identifying our indigenous population. I served on the Seattle School Board for a few years, and that was one of my kind of pet peeves when they'd share data for us, and they'd show, Caucasian population, white, African American, Black population, Hispanic, Latino population, Asian, Pacific Islander population. And then I'd ask, where's our Native American population? And they said, well, they're so small. We have to be careful if we give out that information, because then someone could say, oh, there's only 5 Native Americans at this place. We can't say that because then people would know who those 5 were. So there's some fear they had, but it made us invisible. So I asked them, well, please don't make us invisible. At least acknowledge, put a footnote that, yes, there are Native people here at this school, but, we can't share their numbers because of fear that people will know who they are. And we also get lost in the multiracial category, that we have to speak up and say, if someone is from one of our underserved, marginalized communities, and they're also identified with the majority community, like maybe they're American Indian and white, instead of putting them in the multiracial category, let's put them in the American Indian category so we know where they are. And we know that they're there. Because that's what's happening with a lot of our population. Do they deny their other, heritage? Or do they grasp on the one? Be proud of who you are, but make sure we're being counted.
United Way's Indigenous Communities Fund currently comprises members of the Seattle Urban Native Nonprofits, a collaborative of organizations who came together in response to a United Way of King County report about the lives of Indigenous people in the county. The report enumerated challenges facing Indigenous communities, but it also highlighted the community's assets and opportunities. Pinkham said that Seattle Urban Native Nonprofits, also known as SUN, builds power through policy advocacy to advance the well-being of Indigenous communities.
And then SUN, I think, is we're trying to expand beyond the borders or city limits of Seattle. But it allows us to have a joint voice when we go and try to say, we are still here. There are people out there, too, that may have heard or had to break away from their Indigenous heritage because of what their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents went through, where they had to hide it. That if you say you're Indigenous, you're going to be discriminated against, you won't get a job. That was, unfortunately, a fact that some of our Indigenous families went through. But what they did know was that their grandparents, parents, great-grandparents told them, okay, you are Indigenous. Right now we can't show it to, get our, because of discrimination that we may face. But they let them know. And they did that, I see, for a reason. Okay, make the most of your life, but there'll be some time in your lifetime where you can come out and say, I'm proud to be who I am. I worked with students at the University of Washington, said, yes, Scott, I am Indigenous. I was told by my grandmother that we are, but they had to hide it. And I said, well, they told you that for a reason. So now is the time for you to seek out, talk to your grandparents again, find out, where did we come from? How can I reconnect with that community? The United Indians of All Tribes, the Seattle Urban Native Nonprofits could also be a resource for those to help people find out, reconnect with their heritage.
Scott Pinkham, United Indians of All Tribes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Katsiaya.
To learn more about United Indians of All Tribes Foundation, log on to unitedindians.org. Our neighbors are doing their best to keep food on the table, but it's not been easy. During the COVID-19 pandemic, grocery prices rose to their biggest increase in 50 years. Most of the federal dollars that addressed the food crisis during the pandemic are gone, but grocery bills remain high. That's why United Way of King County has launched the Our Neighbor Fund to invest in strategies that will feed families in the coming year. Our Neighbor Fund will help expand our home grocery program to provide 5,000 families with free groceries each week, and it will help an additional 100 schools in King County implement the Breakfast After the Bell program, impacting 49,000 students. We're asking you to please make a gift to the Our Neighbor Fund so that we can serve more of our neighbors. For more information or to make a donation, log on to uwkc.org/donate. Join us for the Holiday Exchange with Community Passageways on December 7th from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. at 306 23rd Avenue South, Suite 101 in Seattle. Here's a chance to roll up your sleeve and take action against homelessness, hunger, and poverty. You can help United Way grantee Community Passageways assist their neighbors with all-day festivities, including painting and games. For more information, log on to uwkc.org/events. At United Way of King County, we are working side by side with communities to build an equitable future for everyone. Hourglass United Way is a podcast that highlights how we and our partners spend time making a difference in our communities. Our work is made possible by the generous donations from people like you. Please send comments and suggestions about our podcast to hourglassunitedway@gmail.com. To learn more about our work or to support United Way, log on to uwkc.org. I'm your host, Joe Burris. Thanks for listening. Until next time.